Remove the cross or face a fine, the judge said flatly, not even looking up. But Pope Francis didn't move. He simply asked, "Under what law?" And suddenly the entire courtroom realized they weren't dealing with just a priest. Before we reveal what happened next, hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The courtroom wasn't just small, it was suffocating. The kind of government space designed to make people feel insignificant before they even spoke. Courtroom 4C on Center Street had that particular smell you only find in places where hope comes to die quietly. Stale coffee, cheap cologne, and the lingering scent of yesterday's rain still clinging to damp overcoats hung on the back of wooden benches worn smooth by decades of nervous hands. You could taste the anxiety in the air, that particular flavor of fear that rises when people who don't speak the language of power are forced to plead their case in it anyway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like impatient insects, casting everyone in the same unflattering glow, prosecutor, defendant, spectator alike. No one looked their best under those lights. That was probably the point. Justice here wasn't meant to be beautiful, it was meant to be efficient, like an assembly line processing human lives at a steady clip. The Alvarez family huddled together, in the front row like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to each other as the only familiar thing in a sea of procedures they barely understood. Carlos's work-worn hands wouldn't stop fidgeting with his only tie, borrowed from a neighbor and slightly too short. Anna kept adjusting her scarf as if trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. Their teenage son translated whispers between them, his eyes darting nervously toward the empty judge's bench. Their public defender looked barely old enough to order a drink, all pressed suit and polished shoes that hadn't seen enough courtrooms to scuff properly yet. His tie was knotted perfectly, but his fingers tapped an anxious rhythm against his too-thin case file. And in the second-to-last row, a solitary figure sat perfectly still. He wore plain white robes that seemed to absorb the harsh lighting rather than reflect it. A simple silver cross rested against his chest, catching the light when he breathed. His shoes were black and practical, scuffed at the toes from miles of walking on streets most people in power never visited. His face carried the quiet weathering of someone who had seen both beauty and suffering in equal measure and found reason to remain gentle despite it all. The bailiff nudged the clerk with his elbow. "You see that guy?" The clerk glanced up from her folders. The priest or whatever? Yeah. Something about him seems familiar. No one approached him directly. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't even speaking, just sitting with his hands folded loosely in his lap, watching the room with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that presence sometimes matters more than words. When Judge Meredith Klein entered, everyone scrambled to their feet. The man in white rose with them, not hurried, not performative, just respectful. He bowed his head slightly as the judge took her seat, the gesture so subtle it was almost private, and while attorneys shuffled papers and court officers called the room to order, not a single person realized they were in the presence of Pope Francis. Not as a religious icon, not as a global figure, just as an old man wearing a cross and carrying a question no one had asked yet. 2 days earlier, the chapel in the South Bronx hadn't just been small, it had been forgotten. The kind of storefront ministry that city planners erase from maps and developers circle in red. Its walls were the color of surrender, but someone had placed fresh flowers beneath the simple wooden cross, and the coffee pot in the back hissed with a stubborn hospitality. A hand-lettered sign taped inside the door read, "Free legal aid consultations, Tuesdays at noon." The words were faded, the tape yellow with age, but the promise remained fresh every week. Pope Francis, traveling as Father Jorge Mario Bergoglio, had slipped into the city without fanfare or security detail. Sister Rosa nearly dropped her coffee mug when he walked through the door. "Holy Father," she whispered, instinctively reaching to kiss his ring. He gently drew his hand back. "Just Father Jorge today," he said with a smile that softened his correction. "Please." She understood. Immediately. She'd served in this parish long enough to recognize when someone needed to disappear into anonymity, even if that someone usually had his face on magazine covers. He sat through the morning mass like any visiting priest, then quietly took a folding chair in the back corner of the parish hall as volunteer lawyers set up their card tables. The room filled with families, mostly undocumented, all terrified of the system they were trying to navigate. That's where he first saw them, the Alvarez family. Carlos didn't just walk into the room, he carried himself like a man who had been standing upright against storms for so long his spine had forgotten how to bend. 17 years of construction work had left his hands permanently dusted with concrete memories, his shoulders slightly uneven from carrying loads meant for machines, not men. Anna moved beside him with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned to read threats in the subtlest shifts of atmosphere. A raised eyebrow at a school registration desk, a too long stare from a building inspector, the particular silence that follows a question about legal status. They sat at the last table, speaking softly to a harried volunteer who kept checking his watch, his attention already drifting to the next family in line before they'd even finished explaining their situation. The Alvarez's faces showed the particular strain of people who were used to being half seen, quarter heard, barely believed, a strain that settles into the muscles around the eyes first, then works its way down to permanently tighten the mouth. Francis didn't approach immediately. Instead, he watched the room, not with judgment, but with a recognition that felt like coming home. These were the faces he knew from the villas miserias of Buenos Aires. Different languages, same story. The geography of exclusion looked the same everywhere. The downward glances, the nervous fingers fiddling with papers they couldn't read fully, the practiced art of trying to look both present and invisible at the same time. It was a dance he had witnessed on 3 continents, in barrios and favelas and housing projects. The choreography of survival when systems weren't built with you in mind. When the volunteer rushed off, leaving the family with a half-completed form, Francis finally approached. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat. Carlos nodded cautiously. Francis sat down, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like someone who had learned that sudden gestures often startled people who lived with constant uncertainty. "I'm Father Jorge," he said, his accented English carrying the warmth of someone who had learned the language by listening rather than studying. "I'm visiting the parish." His voice had that particular quality that made people feel like they were the only person in the room. A focused gentleness that somehow cut through background noise without ever raising in volume. He didn't ask for their story immediately. Instead, he asked their names, asked about their son's school, asked Anna about the embroidery on her blouse. Only then did he glance at the forms. "Housing court?" he asked. Carlos exhaled heavily. "Eviction. New owners want everyone out who doesn't. Have proper papers." "We've always paid," Anna added quickly. "Every month for 12 years in cash." "But no receipts," Francis guessed. "Some," Carlos said, "but the new company says they don't count. Not official enough." The Pope nodded slowly. "May I see your court papers?" They hesitated. "Are you a lawyer?" Carlos asked. "No," Francis said, a small smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "But I have seen enough courts to recognize when someone is being pushed out of the room before they've spoken." Inna slid the wrinkled court summons across the table without further question. Later that afternoon, Sister Rosa caught him studying a law book from the parish's small library. "You shouldn't get involved," she warned. "This judge is famous for her strictness, doesn't tolerate outside interference." Francis looked up, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Then perhaps it is better I show up quietly, Even quietly, she said. You still walk like someone people notice. He nodded. Then I'll sit in the back. And what good will that do? Sister Rosa challenged. Francis carefully folded the court summons. Sometimes, when injustice walks through the front doors, presence, real presence, is all that's needed to hold the door open for truth. He did not attend that Thursday hearing as the Pope. He attended as a man who had once walked the slums of Buenos Aires with nothing but his faith and his questions. And so, Jorge Mario Bergoglio walked into a New York courtroom, took a seat in the second-to-last row, and waited. Judge Meredith Klein ran her courtroom like a Swiss timepiece, precise, predictable, utterly without sentiment. Her reputation was built on efficiency, not mercy. Lawyers respected her for it. Defendants feared her for the same reason. As she called the Alvarez case, she didn't even look up from her papers. The family's public defender rose nervously. Your Honor, we're requesting a continuance based on denied, Klein said, the word clipped short. The city has already granted 2 extensions. Proceed. The city's housing council didn't even stand fully, just straightened in his chair, the posture of someone who knew he'd already won. Your Honor, the facts are clear. No valid lease, no official payment records. Francis sat motionless, watching, with quiet attention. The silver cross caught the fluorescent light with each breath. It was the cross that drew the clerk's attention. She whispered to the bailiff, who approached the bench and murmured in the judge's ear. Klein paused mid-sentence, her eyes flicking to the back of the courtroom. Excuse me, she said, looking directly at Francis. Before we proceed, sir, in the white robes, please step forward. Every head turned. Francis rose calmly and walked down the center aisle. His footsteps made no sound. When he reached the rail separating spectators from participants, he stopped, not submissively, not defiantly, just present. Are you here in any official capacity? Klein asked. No, Your Honor, Francis replied, his voice gentle but clear. Only as a friend of the family. The judge studied him. You're wearing religious attire. That is not permitted under this court's neutrality policy. You'll need to remove or conceal that cross. Francis glanced at the simple silver cross, then looked back at the judge. I'm afraid I cannot, he said with a gentleness that made his refusal sound like regret rather than defiance. It is not decoration, it is identity. The words rippled through the courtroom. Judge Klein's posture stiffened. This is not a place for spiritual expression. The rules are clear. Francis nodded. I understand. I will remain seated if permitted, quietly, without disruption. That's not the issue, she replied. It's the symbol itself. It violates policy. Francis inclined his head. Then if the court deems it appropriate, I will accept the penalty. The judge blinked. You're willing to be fined? Yes, he said simply. If the law demands it, I will not argue. The room went still. The city attorney stopped, thumbing through his phone. The public defender's nervous foot-tapping ceased. Klein picked up her pen. A citation will be issued. This court cannot make exceptions for symbols of belief. That includes yours. Francis nodded once. Thank you for your clarity, Your Honor. He turned to return to his seat, but before he sat down he paused. Your Honor, he said, if I may, could you share the statute this courtroom relies on for that particular restriction? Klein's eyebrows rose. What? The legal basis for the prohibition of personal religious symbols in publicly funded legal proceedings. There was nothing accusatory in his voice, just a question, but it cut through the room with precision. Judge Klein stared at him. You're not here to argue the law. No, he agreed, but if I am being fined by it, I would like to understand it. For the first time, the judge's posture lost its rigid certainty. I'll ask the clerk to provide it after the hearing, she said. Francis nodded. That would be very kind. He returned to his seat. But now the room felt different, not louder, just more awake. The case resumed, but no one looked quite as comfortable anymore. By the time the city's attorney resumed questioning, something invisible pressed against the edges of the proceedings. Not disruption, just a kind of gravity, pulling everything slightly off course. "Your clients cannot provide a rental agreement, correct?" he asked the public defender. "No, but they paid in cash every month for 12 years, which," the city lawyer interrupted, "is conveniently untraceable." Francis remained motionless, watching with eyes that had witnessed this same scene play out in countless languages, under countless systems. Carlos's knuckles whitened around the edge of the table. Anna stared at the floor, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been curse. Sometimes they're the same thing when systems fail you. The judge made a note, then looked up. "Father," she said, hesitation in her voice. "You're still wearing the cross." Francis nodded. "I am. You understand that continued refusal to comply could result in contempt charges?" "I do," he said, "but I am not refusing. I am simply remaining." The distinction was subtle but profound. It wasn't defiance. It was presence. And somehow that disarmed her more effectively than any argument. Behind him, a clerk whispered to the bailiff, "Can she really fine him for wearing a cross?" There's no actual law against it, just the courthouse policy. A court. A official approached the bench with a printed document. Klein read it twice, her eyes narrowing as she processed what she was seeing. It wasn't federal law, it wasn't even state statute. It was an internal courthouse policy, meant to prevent disruptive proselytizing. But this man wasn't preaching, he was simply wearing a cross. Klein looked back at him. He was watching her without challenge, simply waiting. As the housing agency delivered its final statement, a coldly efficient recitation of policies and clauses that reduced human lives to procedural footnotes, Francis leaned forward slightly, in his seat, not dramatically, just enough to signal his complete attention. Then, with a gentleness that somehow commanded the room more effectively than a shout could have, he raised his hand. It was a simple gesture, nothing theatrical about it, just the quiet movement of someone who had something to say and knew exactly when to say it. In that moment, his stillness became a kind of gravity, pulling everyone's attention toward him without effort. The judge hesitated. "Yes? I apologize for the interruption," he said, "but may I ask one question of the—" "Counsel?" "You're not counsel," she reminded him. "I'm not," he agreed, "but if the court would permit me, I believe I have one question that may illuminate the matter." It was highly irregular. Everyone knew it, but something about him made it suddenly hard. "To say no, you may ask one question," Klein said. Francis turned to the city attorney. "Madam, did your office receive any record of payment from the Alvarez family's prior landlord?" The attorney blinked. "There's no official lease. No formal documentation," Francis smiled gently. "That wasn't my question. I asked if you received any payment record, formal or informal." The attorney hesitated. "There was an envelope of receipts, but they were handwritten, not official. Written by the landlord's hand. Yes, but they were incomplete. We deemed them inadmissible." Francis turned to the judge. "So the court has not seen these documents?" "No," she admitted. Francis nodded. "Then perhaps before ruling, the court might review the documents that exist, even if they are imperfect. The people before you may not speak the language of contracts, Your Honor, but they understand the language of trust." The judge didn't speak, but she didn't dismiss him either. For the first time that day, she looked not just at her paperwork, but at the people in the room. "Father," she began, "you said you're not here in any official capacity, so why are you here at all?" Francis stood. "I came because the family asked for someone to bear witness. Not to speak, just to see what they could not explain." She studied him. "And yet here you are. asking questions, challenging counsel. He nodded. Sometimes silence does not protect truth, and when it doesn't, we must speak. There was no protest from the courtroom, no objection from the attorneys. I'll allow you to proceed, but be brief, the judge said. Francis stepped forward. In 1987, the Second Circuit ruled in Singh versus Board of Education that personal religious expression, when not coercive, performative, or disruptive, remains protected in government spaces, including courtrooms. That decision built upon precedents from Tinker and Widmar, affirming that secular neutrality does not require religious erasure. The judge's eyebrow raised slightly. In surprise, Your Honor, your citation policy may have merit in preventing grandstanding. But to ask a man to remove a cross worn quietly is not the enforcement of neutrality. It is the removal of identity. And in this courtroom, where identity is often the very thing on trial, it matters. Francis shifted to the case at hand. As for the Alvarez family, the receipts your counsel dismissed, have they been formally reviewed by the court? They weren't submitted properly. Then, with your permission, I would like to offer a copy. He reached into his cassock and withdrew a simple folded envelope containing handwritten notes signed by a landlord with dates and amounts. The judge examined the papers. These show 12 months of payment, she said with surprise. Francis nodded. They prove nothing definitive on their own, but they prove enough to raise a question, a reasonable doubt that this family acted in good faith. He looked around the courtroom. Justice is not the punishment of imperfection. It is the defense of dignity. The law is not a sword for the strong. It is a shield for the vulnerable. He stepped back. I've said enough. The judge didn't speak. The city's attorney cleared her throat. Your Honor, I need time to review these. Judge Klein looked up. You'll have that time. And you... She turned to the Alvarez's lawyer. May request formal reconsideration. Francis returned to his seat without flourish, but the room hadn't returned to normal. You could feel it, the discomfort of people realizing they'd missed something important, that a man in simple robes had walked into a secular courtroom, accepted a fine for his faith, and gently dismantled a system too sure of its own rigidity. The hearing ended with a judge who suddenly looked like she had a lot more reading to do. Carlos Alvarez didn't understand the legal language, but when his lawyer turned and gave him a single stunned nod, he grasped the meaning immediately. They hadn't lost. As the court cleared, the judge surprised everyone. Father, she called softly. Yes, Your Honor? May I speak with you in chambers? Every remaining eye in the courtroom widened. In her chambers, Klein stood by the window, arms folded across her chest. You could have embarrassed me in front of a room full of people. I didn't come to embarrass anyone, he replied. No, she said after a moment, but you did. Just not with anger, with clarity. The admission seemed to cost her something, a small price paid in pride. She turned to face him fully, studying him with the careful assessment of someone re-evaluating a first impression. That legal citation, you were accurate. I checked with my clerk during the recess. Singh vs. Board of Education, 1987. Not many people outside the judiciary remember that case. I try to be accurate, he said simply, his humility not a performance, but a practiced habit. His eyes held neither triumph nor smugness, just the steady gaze of someone who had long ago stopped measuring victories by who won and started measuring them by what was true. So, where did you study law? Francis smiled. Not in law school, but I've spent many years reading arguments, canon law, civil rights briefings, cases brought by the poor, against the poor, and sometimes against their very dignity. So you're not a lawyer, but you know how to think like one. He shook his head. No, I try to think like a shepherd, but even a shepherd must know the land he walks on. The judge exhaled. You made me look twice at a rule I haven't questioned in years, and I don't like being questioned, Francis nodded. That's why most systems grow rigid, because we confuse silence with efficiency. She looked at him with something softer than before. You're dangerous. I hope not, he replied. No, not like that. I mean, you walk into a room and say everything without raising your voice. You wear something that's not allowed, and somehow you make everyone question why it was banned in the first place. Francis gave a small shrug. That's not power, that's presence. She extended her hand. I still think courtrooms should be secular, but I also think maybe they should remember who they're really for. As he turned to leave, she called out one last time. What if I hadn't listened? Francis looked back. Then I would have returned tomorrow and sat in the same seat, wearing the same cross, still silent, still present. Judge Klein nodded slowly. There was no press release, no viral clip, no headline, shouting, Pope defies judge in U.S. courtroom. The moment passed in the official record like any other line of law, but not for the people who had been in that room. Carlos and Ana Alvarez stepped out into the sharp New York air, clutching each other's hands like a lifeline thrown to drowning sailors. They didn't say much, just gracias repeated like a prayer, unsure of what had just happened or who exactly the quiet man in white had been. But something had shifted in their posture, the particular straightening of shoulders that happens when people suddenly realize they might not be as powerless as they'd been told. Their public defender, a young man who had entered law school with ideals already fraying at the edges, went back to his office that afternoon and spent 4 uninterrupted hours reading housing code he thought he already knew. He cancelled his happy hour plans. Ordered in dinner. By midnight, he had drafted 3 more motions for other clients in similar situations. He printed the ruling Francis had cited and pinned it to his corkboard with a handwritten note. Ask better questions next time. Judge Meredith. Klein didn't speak of the incident to her colleagues. She didn't need to. But a week later, a new line quietly appeared in her courtroom guidelines. Personal religious articles may be worn unless disruptive or used to influence the court. It wasn't announced. It wasn't debated. It just changed, the way many important things do, not with fanfare, but with quiet revision. A junior court clerk bought a pocket-sized constitution that evening, not for show, just to understand how something so small, like a silver cross, could shake a courtroom's foundations without raising its voice. And back at the rectory, Sister Rosa found a folded copy of the citation taped inside Francis's journal. She asked if he planned to appeal it. No, he said. Some things are worth paying for. She glanced at the citation, which he'd underlined in blue ink. Violation of courtroom neutrality. Unauthorized religious display. And next to it, in his handwriting, neutrality must never mean absence of soul. Francis left New York the next morning, without ceremony. Just a handshake for Sister Rosa and a promise to write. But as the plane lifted off from JFK, a city of 8 million people continued its day, completely unaware that one of its smallest courtrooms had been transformed, not by power, not by protest, but by presence. Not everyone saw it. Most of New York continued its rhythms unaware, taxi drivers arguing over fares, Wall Street traders watching numbers rise and fall, tourists photographing the same skyline from the same angles, children racing to school beneath the shadows of skyscrapers. The city's pulse continued uninterrupted, but the ones who did see it, they'd never forget it, because some moments don't need to make headlines to make history. Some revolutions happen in whispers. Some of the most profound changes begin not with marches and banners and speeches, but with a single quiet question, asked by someone brave enough to remain when everyone expects them to leave. If you had been in that courtroom, would you have spoken up? Would you have kept your cross on, or quietly taken it off just to avoid the trouble? And maybe the harder question is, how often do we let small rules erase big truths? Let us know in the comments. We read every single If this story made you stop and think, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. And don't forget to turn on the bell icon so you never miss another story like this one. And if you know someone who still thinks humility and intelligence can't exist in the same person, share this video with them, not to argue, but to invite our. Other stories should be appearing on your screen now. Tap 1 to keep watching. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another story inspired by the legacy of Pope Francis.